When we learn to speak as children, it happens apparently without any effort. Nobody sits down with a baby to teach them the rules of English grammar, or whatever language they speak, and still, children who grow up in an English-speaking environment learn to speak perfect, fluent English within the first few years of their life. You can compare learning to speak with learning to walk. It's something that happens at a certain point in the development of any normal child. Not only do we not have to teach them how to do it, we probably couldn't stop them if we tried. Learning to read and write is very different. For most people, it's not something that happens by itself. It has to be explicitly taught and consciously practiced over a period of time. It's more like tying your shoelaces, which most people can't figure out how to do on their own. Someone has to show them, and they need to make an active effort to learn it. All human communities use spoken language, or sign language in deaf communities, but not all use writing. Spoken language was developed in our species much earlier than written language. We don't know exactly how long humans have been able to speak, but writing was only invented around 3,500 before the Christian era, which is at least tens of thousands of years after speech first developed. So there are significant differences between spoken and written language, and there is an important sense in which spoken language is primary. At the same time, written language is not just a direct graphic representation of spoken language. Both spoken and written language have their own separate characteristics, and there are significant differences between them. The same linguistic system is the basis for both spoken and written language, and in that sense, they're both forms of the same language. But they exploit different features of the system and have different properties. Written language has greater social prestige in most societies where it's used. It has greater official recognition. In most cases, when you need to communicate something important to an official institution or a company, such as filing your tax return or applying for a job, you're expected to do so in writing, not just talk to someone. Written language also has greater legal force. Written contracts are perceived as having a greater validity than a spoken agreement. And written language typically forms the standard for prestigious forms of the spoken language, so that speaking correctly is taken to mean speaking in a way that's similar to how you would write. Both spoken and written language come with their own advantages and disadvantages. Writing has the advantage of being permanent and visible, whereas speech can only be perceived through hearing, and it's gone as soon as it's been produced. Writing allows communication over long distances, which wasn't possible with speech until radios and telephones were invented. When we produce writing, we can plan what we're going to say and revise it as we go. I'm sure many of us have wished that that was possible with spoken language, when we say something that we regret as soon as it's out of our mouth. At the other end of the communication event, when someone's reading a piece of writing, they can take their time to process it, scan through it for the main points, and reread it as many times as they like. Being able to write things down means we can keep hold of information without having to keep it all in our memory. It also makes it easy to preserve information beyond the life of a single individual and to create enduring works of literature. On the other hand, spoken language is quicker to produce than written language. It's direct and interactive and allows for immediate feedback. This means that it's easy for communication partners to ask questions or ask for clarification, and so it's easier to make sure that what you're saying has been properly understood. Speaking also allows us to use extra clues like intonation and body language to bring our message across. We know that this can be a problem in writing. For example, when someone's joking or being ironic online, and people think they're being serious because they don't have these clues to help them figure out the intended meaning. This is one reason why emoticons, smiley faces and so on, have become so common in social media, because it brings written language closer to spoken language by adding in some new kinds of non-linguistic clues. Speaking is a social activity which takes place between people in a social setting and helps integrate people into social groups. It's an everyday activity that everyone participates in, as opposed to writing, which depends on access to education, and so in many societies is only accessible to a small elite. On the other hand, when we speak, we lack many of the means for clearly structuring our message, which is available when we write. We can't use paragraph structure or punctuation, capitalization or other visual devices which help clarify our message when we write. The visible and permanent properties of writing also means that it's easier to use more complex sentence structures and text structures when we write, because the reader can go back and reread a piece of text if the structure wasn't clear the first time around. To summarise, here's a comparison of some typical features of speech versus writing. Speech is typically less explicit. We can leave more to be understood by the context, whereas writing is typically more explicit because there's less context to allow you to infer various understood meanings, and so we need to make the writing more explicit to ensure that our readers understand what we want to say. Spoken language has less clear sentence boundaries. When we speak, one sentence typically runs into the next, whereas written language has clear sentence boundaries are indicated by punctuation. Speech typically has a simpler and looser structure, whereas writing typically has a more complex and integrated structure. Spoken language is typically more repetitive and has a more restricted vocabulary, whereas written language tends to be less repetitive and have a less restricted vocabulary. In speaking, it's normal to have a certain degree of disfluency, meaning that we make errors as we speak and have to correct ourselves. Written language, on the other hand, typically shows fluency, at least in the final form after we've been through a number of drafts. In speech, we have monitoring features such as hearing that we've said something we didn't intend to say and going back and correcting ourselves, and these are not available in written language. Speech relies on interaction features such as immediate feedback, questions for clarifications and so on, which we don't have in written language, and speech is typically associated with more informal features, whereas written language is associated with more formal features.